viewers. This is George Ondek with the latest edition of the George Ondek Show, and I'm very proud tonight to have PHILLIP MUSEGAAS with me, who's with the Riverkeeper of Westchester. Good evening, Phil. How you doing?
Good evening, George. I'm doing well. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Riverkeeper and its aims and goals, Phil?
Sure thing. Riverkeeper is an environmental organization completely supported by our members. And our mission is to work on the Hudson River and protect the Hudson River from pollution, to restore the Hudson River ecosystem, and also to protect the New York City drinking water supply. And Riverkeeper has been working on the Hudson River for over 40 years. We started out as a group of commercial fishermen who were concerned about declining fish populations. And we turned to do what's now kind of an environmental law firm. So we use federal and state laws to actually enforce laws and bring lawsuits against people who pollute in the Hudson River. We have a boat that patrols the Hudson River for 9 months of the year. And you know, our mission is very simple. We're protecting the Hudson Valley environment, and the Hudson River is our focus. And so,
Phil, the reason I'm having you on tonight is because I live in Peekskill, 3 miles from Indian Point, the nuclear power station of Entergy's. And in light of what's happening in Japan right now with their nuclear power plant, which is about the same age as this plant, built by the same company, GE, I'm wondering how safe are the people of Westchester from an accident such as just happened in Japan, and our environment, our fish in the water, and the total surrounding area.
Well, the accident, the earthquake and tsunami, and of course this terrible tragedy that we're seeing in Japan, and the nuclear disaster that we are seeing still unfolding in Japan, should really be a wake-up call, I think, to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, to Entergy, to the companies that own this nuclear plant. And we should be concerned. We should not be alarmed and panic at all about this, but the best thing to do is for people who live near the plant to really become educated about what the risks of Indian Point are, and to talk to their local officials and elected officials and really find out the truth about this plant, because the accident in Japan actually is showing us a couple of serious things. One, when you have a loss of electrical power to a nuclear power plant, that can lead to a serious accident and releases of radiation. That's what we had in Japan. The tsunami knocked out the backup electrical generators for the plant. They could not get electrical power back to the plant, and so that allowed the nuclear reactors and the spent fuel pools to heat up over the course of several days and basically breach their containment and release radiation into the atmosphere. Now, we can't have a tsunami in the Hudson Valley. There may be a small chance we can have one, but that's not the main concern. The concern is if you have a flood or a storm surge, or God forbid, an intentional attack on the plant, a terrorist attack of some sort, and you disable the backup power systems and you cut off the power to the plant, then that can lead to the type of situation we see in Japan. And so there is a real risk here. And we also have new information about an increased earthquake risk at Indian Point. That sounds hard to believe too, because we're not in California. But in 2008, Columbia University and Lamont Doherty's seismologists did a study of the history of earthquakes in the Hudson Valley, and they looked at Indian Point, and they actually discovered that there was an earthquake fault that they were not aware of before that runs near Indian Point. And there's another fault that they did know about, but they realized was now an active fault. So now the situation we have is Indian Point is sited less than a mile from 2 intersecting earthquake faults. These are active faults, and according to the Columbia University study, these faults can have an earthquake of 6 or 7 on the Richter scale. That is entirely possible. When Entergy was asked about the earthquake risk, they said that they could withstand an earthquake of 6.0 on the Richter scale. And so there's clearly a disconnect. And please stop me, yes.
In Japan, they said they could stop an earthquake of up to 7.5.
Yes.
But the earthquake was 9. They didn't anticipate that. How do they know that 5 will be the most, or 6 or 7? And is it worth the gamble with 15 or 20 million people's lives?
Well, I think they don't know what the risk is, and the problem with these nuclear power plants and other things like oil drilling and all these things we've seen, these catastrophes happen, they don't plan for the worst case scenario. Indian Point definitely does not plan for that. And the concern over the emergency evacuation plans, you mentioned 20 million people living
within a 30-mile zone, 35-mile zone.
Roughly a 50-mile area around Indian Point. Now, Indian Point is only required to develop an emergency plan, an evacuation plan, for a 10-mile area around the plant. And this makes no sense now that we've seen what's happened in Japan, where we have people evacuated to 20 miles away. We have the drinking water in Tokyo, which is 140 miles away now, showing signs of contamination from radiation. We have contaminated food and dairy products found 70 and 80 miles away from the plants in Japan. And so clearly, when you have a nuclear accident and you have a radiation release, it is possible for that contamination to spread much further than just a 10-mile area. And so I think we have to go back to the drawing board here in New York. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which oversees nuclear power plants in the U.S., has to wake up and take a look at this. And they should close the plant. When they look at where Indian Point is located, so close to New York City, so close to 2 earthquake faults, a history of mechanical problems, a history of safety issues, to us, it seems logical to consider closing that plant to remove that risk from this area.
And from what I heard from what you were saying, it doesn't necessarily take an earthquake or a tsunami wave to cause a plant's energy system to shut down. Mm-hmm. And if it shuts down longer than what the backup battery power to the plant can be, it can be a catastrophe. Is that correct? That
is correct. That's entirely possible, and that's important to understand when people are hearing about what happened in Japan. What they're hearing is that the tsunami caused the nuclear reactor this plant to go haywire, and that was the event that started everything, the earthquake and the tsunami. But the real problem, the thing that led to these meltdowns in Japan, was the loss of electrical power. And nuclear power plants, because they run at such high temperatures, when they shut down, they need enormous amounts of water pumped through the plant to cool the nuclear reactors and to keep the nuclear waste pools cooled off. When that electrical power is taken away, those cooling water pumps can't run, then you have problems. And they're supposed to have backup diesel power generators are supposed to supply power. In Japan, those were destroyed by the tsunami. If you have a situation here where those backup generators are flooded by a storm surge or by a severe flood, or they're knocked offline by an earthquake, or their cooling water systems are just damaged by an accident or a natural disaster, then when you lose that backup power, you lose the ability to really cool the plant over the course of several days. That can lead to a serious accident. It
sounds like even our present governor is questioning whether this should be relicensed for another 20 years. I ask you, in light of it's one of the oldest plants in America, why 20 years? Why isn't it 3 years or 5 years? Or
sure.
Shut it down.
Well, we think it should be shut down. We think that's the logical.
You know, even if it's shut down, does that end the problem? Because I understand Yucca Mountain in Nevada won't accept spent fuel rods and spent fuel from a nuclear plant, but we're storing them there now.
That's right.
And are they in them containment buildings that are so secure from an air attack or a 9/11 attack? Or are they stored somewhere else where they're more vulnerable?
The nuclear waste the spent fuel is stored actually not in the containment domes, but it's stored in the smaller regular industrial buildings that are next to the reactors. And so the spent fuel pools contain much more radioactive waste and toxic material than even the reactors themselves. They contain about 5 times as much radiation as the reactor cores. And this is an enormous concern, and we're seeing this play out in Japan, unfortunately, because they lost cooling water to these spent fuel pools in Japan. over the course of a week, in one of the pools, they're concerned all the water has boiled away. And when this fuel is radioactive and it remains very, very hot even after it's taken out of the reactor. And so it has to be continuously cooled with fresh water. And if that water's taken away, the fuel will actually heat up and potentially start to burn and melt and release radiation into the atmosphere.
Paul, when the Philip, when the company that runs this puts out a multi-million-dollar advertising campaign in our local papers and in the New York Times, full-page ads saying that they're safe, sound, and vital, what are your feelings on that? And can those news media fairly report on whether Indian Point should stay open or not?
Well, our response to safe, secure, and vital is old, unnecessary, and too much risk. And it's not quite as catchy, but we really believe the plant, based on this new information about earthquakes and the evacuation zone, we don't think the plant is safe. Secure, we've had concerns, unfortunately, since 9/11 about security at the plant. We have concerns about how well the plant can withstand a natural disaster. We don't think it's a secure facility. And vital, Entergy is continuously spouting these misleading numbers about providing 30 to 40% of the region's power needs. Now, that is not true.
When you say regions, is it true that they supply the power to New York City and not Westchester? Or do they supply Westchester as well? Because we're taking the main risk right here in Peekskill, Ossining, Katona, or anywhere else in the surrounding area.
Well, they do supply, our understanding is they do supply power to New York City, Westchester County, and Long Island. And it's a little difficult to track because some of the power is sold under public contracts, like with Con Edison. Some of it is sold under private contracts that we don't know. But basically, the power goes into the grid, and because most of the power demand is here in downstate New York, most of the power is sold here. And so it does go in this, it is sold in this area, but it is not the 30% that Entergy says. It's closer to 12.5% that it's actually supplying to this area.
I have just heard in the past day the mayor of Stony Point advocating a natural gas plant to replace Indian Point. Is that feasible, and is that more economic, more environmental, better for the environment?
Well, it is feasible. I think that idea has been proposed before. There's an old power plant site across the river from Indian Point in Stony Point, and I think they could build if they built a natural gas, what's called a combined cycle natural gas, which is a very efficient, state-of-the-art natural gas burning power plant that could be tied into the grid in Rockland County. I'm not sure if it could replace all 2,000 megawatts. I think it would depend on the proposal, but it certainly could take a chunk of that power. And if it's not using Hudson River water and it's using clean burning natural gas, then it's fairly environmentally friendly. And so that would be a good development.
Is it possible that the profit margin could be more important to operators of a nuclear plant than the safety margin, which, from what I've heard, Indian Point generates $1 million a day in profit? I don't know if that's true.
That's what, as of a couple years ago, it was $1 million a day. We're not sure what it is now, but it's definitely a profitable plant for that company. And keep in mind, this is not a utility that's owned and regulated by the state. This is what they call a merchant plant. So this company produces the power as a private company and sells it on the open market. So their incentive is to make money for their shareholders. And they have to do legally what they have to do, the minimum that they're required to do to meet the regulations. But by all indications, for example, they've had 2 transformer explosions in the last 3 years that took the plants offline, that caused fires to break out, caused oil spills into the Hudson River. They've had a history of unplanned emergency shutdowns for mechanical problems. They have leaking spent fuel pools that leak radioactive water into the Hudson River. There is a litany of environmental and safety concerns related to this plant that really raises the question of how well are they maintaining it, how well are they running it? If they're running it to make profits for their shareholders, they're allowed to do that as a business, but they shouldn't do that at the expense of safety for the public that lives near the plant. And that's another reason if we had a plant that had a very good safety record, we might think about it. But the fact we have such a poor safety record and we have the plant located 34 miles from Times Square, it doesn't make sense to keep this plant
And from the
operating.
financial capital of the world, Wall Street.
Indeed, yes.
God forbid it became I won't say a no-fly zone, but a no-inhabitant zone.
That would be horrifying, and that's we're trying to prevent that. And unfortunately, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the agency that oversees these plants, is literally in bed with the industry.
Is it?
Yes, they are.
That's your opinion.
They are a very weak regulator. They don't take enforcement action against these plants. Just over the last few days, we've seen everything that's happened in Japan. The head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission even said, well, if this was an accident in the United States, I would evacuate people out to 50 miles. And so everyone
That's what
looked at
we're
IndianPoint.
doing in Japan, right?
That's what they're recommending for Americans in Japan. And then when this NRC commissioner was asked about IndianPoint, he said, well, no, we were talking about Japan. We think 10 miles is safe enough for IndianPoint.
What I'm watching on the national news, and I go from channel to channel, Fox, CNN, and all the channels, it doesn't appear that the nuclear company in Japan has been totally forthcoming with all the information to the government.
Mm-hmm. That's been a big problem.
Do we have much government oversight into the regulation or the operation of a nuclear plant? And after an accident, do any outside people go in to investigate what happened when we have to take their word? Oh, don't worry, there was no release of radiation. You don't have to bring the Ossining or the Croton Fire Department in. We have our own fire department, and we took care of it. What do you think about that, Philip?
Well, I think it raises a lot of concerns, and it should worry people.
Should we have outside governmental people going in to check on it? Is that the purpose of the NRC, or?
That is the NRC's job. I mean, it's the history of nuclear power in the U.S. is that it's always been the responsibility of the federal government. And the belief behind that was that this is a very specialized, technical, dangerous way to make electricity, and so we have to be able to control it and have the best experts we can working on it. And in principle, that makes sense. But when you have an agency where a lot of the people that work for the NRC, when they leave, they go to work for the industry, they go back to the NRC, they go to the industry. Two of the former commissioners that used to head the NRC, one of them now works for the biggest nuclear consulting company in the world. Another one is teaches and consults with nuclear power companies. And so there's a revolving door of people going in and out of the nuclear industry, and they lose their independence. They lose their objective viewpoint, and they become captive to the industry, and they become more sympathetic to the industry's concerns and the industry's economic worries than they do to the concerns of the local public. The NRC is turning its back on people like you that live here near the plant and have genuine concerns about the plant. NRC has refused to look at the earthquake risk. They have refused to allow the emergency evacuation plan to be considered in this license renewal process and in this hearing process that we have going on for IndianPoint. And that doesn't make sense to us, and people should not be comfortable with that and should question that.
I feel the same way. Do you want to further talk about the cooling towers? They're talking about some way of saving the fish from the Hudson by having some kind of different way of injecting the water from the Hudson into the plant. Right.
Well, just as a little background, IndianPoint, in order to, while it's operating and to keep it cool, it takes in about 2.5 billion gallons a day of Hudson River water. It sucks it in through enormous pipes, and it uses that water to cool the plant, and then it dumps hot water back into the Hudson River. And just to give you an idea how much water this is, the entire population of New York City uses about 1 billion gallons of water a day.
Wow.
So IndianPoint uses 2.5 times what New York City's 8 million people use. And this, by using this water, they suck in lots of fish and fish eggs and small fish, and they kill over 1 billion fish a year. So it has an enormous environmental impact. In 2003, the state of New York actually finally came in and gave them a draft permit, a new operating permit that said that they would have to upgrade to a closed cycle system, which means instead of using Hudson River water continuously, they would build a closed loop system that would basically, like a radiator on your car, it would recirculate and cool the same water supply. The company that owns IndianPoint.m4v refused to do that, and they went to court over that, and so we're litigating that now in court. That's been 7 years later.
You brought up the name of the company, Entergy. Is it true about a year ago they tried to spin off Indian Point to another company? And is the reason they don't want to, something about the cleanup costs after it's closed would be enormous? And maybe you can bring up that issue, and that the rods are stored there, and will they be stored there for the next 100 years? And what effect could that be on the Hudson River and the environment?
Well, in terms of about Entergy's corporate spinoff, they did apply to the state of New York to spin off Indian Point and several other older nuclear power plants into a separate holding company, essentially.
Why?
They did this to make money, and they did this to reduce their risk, to separate, because Entergy owns a lot of power plants around the country.
But they've told us it's safe, secure, and vital.
They have. Well,
but they want to spin it off to some other company?
They want to limit their risk, and they want to limit the parent corporation. They want to keep the parent corporation separate from the risk involved in if they have to build cooling towers, if they have to decommission this plant. These nuclear plant sites, when they're shut down eventually and they have to be cleaned up, it costs enormous amounts of money. The last nuclear plant that was decommissioned and fully cleaned up, it cost 4 times as much money to clean it up as they had estimated. And if the company doesn't have the money, it goes to the taxpayers to pay that difference. So that's something in the long term people here should be very concerned about. And you ask about the nuclear waste, it is true that even if Indian Point closed today, we would reduce the risk of a reactor accident for sure. So the immediate safety concern would be gone. But the nuclear waste, because there's no permanent disposal site for all this waste, it would stay at Indian Point, and it's probably going to stay there for a very long time.
So in effect, Yucca Mountain out in Nevada doesn't want that because it's too dangerous, but it's being stored right here at Buchanan.
That's right. Well, Yucca Mountain is actually a dead project now. The Obama administration cut all the funding for Yucca Mountain. The state of Nevada was very opposed to it because they didn't want this waste being brought in. And there was new information came out of Yucca Mountain that it actually was not the best place to store nuclear waste because water could get into it. It had an earthquake risk as well. And so we're faced with this conundrum now, this problem of what we're going to do with this waste that we have around the country. And we have something like close to, I think, 75 or 80,000 tons of nuclear waste in the US.
I wonder why it was put in Buchanan in the first place. Wasn't it suggested some Storm King Mountain, and is that much further from? Well,
Storm King was a different power plant that Con Ed was suggesting. But at the time Indian Point was built, Con Edison actually was proposing building, I believe, 4 or 5 nuclear plants around, even in New York City and on the Hudson River. And so they ended up only building Indian Point, but it really doesn't make sense. Even back in 1970 when they built it, it was built near an earthquake fault. It was built 5 miles from the drinking water supply.
And their question to you, if you closed it up tomorrow, how do you replace that energy? What is your answer to that, Philip?
You replace, well, first of all, it's not 30% of the energy, it's about 12.5%.
That's all.
Yes, and you can replace it in the short term. You don't have concerns about power because New York State has a 15 to 20% reserve margin of power available at all times. And so if Indian Point goes offline tomorrow because of a mechanical breakdown, there's extra power brought in the state. In the longer term, the state can implement energy efficiency measures and implement some new natural gas generation power plants, as we talked about, and also bring in more renewable power from upstate New York, build new transmission lines. You have to address the energy efficiency We have a California example. When the blackouts happened in California in 2000, the state instituted very aggressive energy efficiency measures, and they were able to save 10 to 14% in their energy use. They lowered their energy use by 10 to 14% in less than a year. And they were able to do that, and if you cut the energy use in New York State by 10%, you would get rid of Indian Point. Now that's not the whole answer, but in the short term, taking those measures and giving the public incentives to save energy can reduce the need for Indian Point. And in the longer term of 3 to 5 years, if you plan for more renewables to come online and be transmitted to New York City, and you build some new natural gas, clean burning, small power plants, or power plant in the Hudson Valley, then you can address this need. This can be done. All it requires is political will.
We've become so reliant on oil and on, now they wanted to go to nuclear. I think they're going to rethink that now.
Definitely.
But I hear there's something like 1,000 years supply of natural gas stored up in America, and we wouldn't have to depend on other countries.
There is enormous potential for natural gas, and there's a glut of natural gas now on the market, actually. So that natural gas prices are very, very low. So that makes it more attractive to build natural gas
So you're
plants.
not completely green then, that you say it can only be wind power or solar power?
Well, I don't think
Although
I mean, ideally, I think if we can find a way to store that energy through fuel cells or other things, then we could rely more and more on renewable energy. And it can be a bigger part of our whole energy needs. But at this stage, with the technology we have, I think we still need power being produced locally. And we don't have enough space in the Hudson Valley to have large wind farms. We would have to build them upstate and bring them downstate. But there's enormous potential in wind and in solar that has not been realized. And in offshore wind farms, for example,
I understand they're doing up at Cape Cod some power on wind farms.
Yes.
But I can't believe it. This has been such an interesting subject, and you've been such an interesting guest. The time has flown by already. So in closing, I have about a minute left.
Okay.
I'd like you to again state your name, your title, if people can reach the Riverkeeper and help in any way, and what should they do to help with the issue of whether Indian Point is viable for the surrounding area.
Well, there's a couple of simple things they can do. And first of all, Riverkeeper, the best way to find out about us is to go to our website. It's www.riverkeeper.org. And we encourage you to look at our mission, look at our work. If you like our work, then we would ask for your support. We can use new members. Memberships is how we get our work done. And you can be a member for as low as $20 a year. So I encourage people to join Riverkeeper and become a member. You should also, if you're concerned about Indian Point, contact your local elected officials. Ask questions about the plant, and don't take Entergy's answers at face value. You know, be persistent, and go after the question, go after the answers that you need. And when you get the real truth about this plant, you'll understand it has to be closed.
And what is that website number?
www.riverkeeper.org.
Again, I thank you very much, Philip
George
Musegaas, who's been my guest tonight, an environmental lawyer with the Riverkeeper, and I thank you for informing my viewers of all the vital issues that are vital to Westchester County and northern Westchester. Thank you very much.